Oh, oh, my best friend and an Oreo cookie. She loves the crunchy chocolate, I like the creamy middle. Been eating them this way since we were very little. We'll always be friends with Oreo.
Yeah, do you remember that old Oreo commercial? Probably brings back some memories. Well, believe it or not, Milk's favorite cookie, it turned 100 last year. But just this week, researchers at Connecticut College said that the Oreo is just as addictive as cocaine, at least in lab rats. I want to point out that these pictures of these lab rats with those Oreos are pretty darn cute, but the researchers could have used any high-fat or high-sugar food. And obviously, a lot of people, they caught their attention. Now, Eric Stice is our go-to guy when it comes to food, our eating habits, and addiction. I spent some time with you, Dr. Stice, in your lab, actually going through a scanner myself. What did you think of the study?
Well, I thought it was provided very good evidence that the palatable foods, high-fat, high-sugar foods, activate brain reward circuitry in a very parallel way that drugs of abuse do.
It's amazing. So, and I want to talk specifically about that. But first of all, these were rats. What about in humans? You've done research in that particular area.
Yeah, no, and a lot of other people have actually administered food in the brain scanners, and it's clear that palatable foods activate our reward centers exactly the same way that they're activated by drugs of abuse. And the rats have, there's a very parallel set of findings coming out of the rat literature that looks exactly like what we see with humans as well.
People think of, when they think of drugs of abuse, cocaine was the example they gave in the study, and people say that's really addictive. Cocaine is very addictive. And now we're drawing this comparison between that and sugar, high-fat, high-sugar foods. Let me start by asking this. How do you define addiction? What does that mean from your perspective?
Addiction really is composed of two concepts. One is the idea of abuse, that you have problems from use. So people who use cocaine lose their jobs or become rejected from their family because of the problems. Those are negative consequences from use. The parallels with overeating would be that you develop medical problems from overeating. But there's also dependence, which is when you get your body physiologically used to having cocaine or palatable food on board, and then it creates a sense of tolerance, so you have to escalate how much cocaine you use to get the same effect. And there's evidence that the same thing happens, that the more you eat Oreos, the more you're going to actually escalate your intake of Oreos to experience the same degree of pleasure.
Because so you start craving them more. If you eat some, you're going to start craving more and therefore eating more than ever. It sounds very cyclical.
Yeah, well, there's two changes that happen in our brains as we, eat a whole bunch of palatable foods on a regular basis. One is that we get a blunted response of our reward circuitry, which is akin to tolerance with drug abuse. So escalating the amount of cocaine you have to do to get high, you would similarly have to escalate the amount of Oreos that you eat to feel the same degree of pleasure. But the other aspect of it is a little bit more insidious, and that is you become hypervigilant to cues that have been associated with the reward from food or drugs, and then when you see those cues, you start craving the food or the drugs, and that's what really maintains the behavior.
But this idea, again, of equating in some way sugar and cocaine, the brain only has one pleasure center, one sort of pleasure area. Does it discriminate between different types of pleasure? Can we really put these on the same sort of ground, sugar and cocaine?
So they're not exactly the same thing in slightly different areas of the reward circuitries involved in each, but this does really extend some work by Surgeon Med out of France very nicely that found that rats would lever press for sweet taste just as much as they lever press for cocaine, and the whole field was very incredulous about this when he initially published the findings, but these new data line right up with that.
Yeah, I saw those studies where the rats would be pushing on the lever just as vigorously for the sugar as the cocaine. Now, let me ask you something. It's a little bit more philosophical almost, but people have heard about the numbers regarding the obesity epidemic. 35% of Americans are not just overweight, but obese. When we release these kinds of studies, is this saying addiction is in some way an excuse